Welcome back to The Synthetic Lens. I'm your host, and this is part 2 of our series on the science of protest. Quick reminder, these voices are AI-generated, but the research we discuss is real and verifiable. Last episode, we covered the surprising data showing that nonviolent resistance succeeds twice as often as violent resistance, and we introduced the 3.5% rule, the finding that no government has withstood sustained nonviolent protest from 3.5% of its population. Today, we're tackling a harder question. Why has protest become less effective in recent years, and what can movements do about it? Dr. Maya Torres is back with us.
Thanks for having me back. And yes, we need to talk about the troubling trends, because the data since 2010 tells a different story than the century before it.
What's changed?
Erica Chenoweth, whose research we discussed last time, has been tracking this closely. Her recent work shows that both violent and nonviolent campaigns have become significantly less effective since 2010. The success rate for nonviolent movements has dropped considerably from that 53% historical average.
That's alarming. What's causing the decline?
Several factors, but they all point to one thing. Authoritarian regimes have been learning. They've studied the movements that brought down their peers, and they've developed countermeasures.
Can you break that down?
Sure. The first major factor is what researchers call smart repression. In the past, when governments cracked down violently on peaceful protesters, it often backfired. The brutality generated sympathy, attracted more participants, and sometimes triggered defections among security forces. Regimes have learned from that. Now they use more subtle tactics.
Like what?
Legal harassment, arresting organizers on minor charges, creating bureaucratic obstacles to assembly, infiltrating movements with informants, spreading disinformation to divide coalitions, throttling internet access during key moments. These tactics suppress movements without generating the kind of dramatic footage that sparks backlash.
So instead of water cannons on the evening news, it's paperwork and algorithms.
Exactly. And it's much harder to build international outrage over someone being denied a permit than over someone being beaten in the street.
What about digital surveillance?
That's the second major factor. The same technologies that help movements organize, social media, messaging apps, smartphones, also make them vulnerable. Governments can monitor communications, identify leaders, map social networks, and preemptively arrest key organizers before protests even begin.
So the tools that enabled the Arab Spring are now being used against movements.
Precisely. And authoritarian regimes share these capabilities with each other. There's been significant cooperation between governments on surveillance technology and crowd control tactics. China, Russia, Iran, various Gulf states, they've created an informal network for exchanging best practices in suppression.
That's chilling.
It is. But there's a third factor that might be even more significant: security force loyalty. Remember, one of the key mechanisms by which nonviolent movements succeed is by triggering defections among police and military. Regimes have gotten much better at preventing that.
How?
Multiple approaches. Better pay and benefits for security forces, careful selection and indoctrination to ensure ideological loyalty, using ethnic or religious minorities as security forces against majority populations, creating social distance, rotating units frequently so they don't form bonds with local communities. Some regimes even bring in foreign mercenaries who have no connection to the population at all.
So they're systematically eliminating the human connection that made soldiers reluctant to fire on their neighbors.
That's exactly right. And it works. We've seen movements in Belarus, Hong Kong, Myanmar, massive participation, incredible bravery, but security forces held firm and the movements were crushed or stalled.
This is pretty discouraging. Is nonviolent resistance still viable?
Chenoweth believes it is, but she's clear that movements need to adapt. The playbook from the 20th century isn't sufficient anymore. Movements need to be smarter, more prepared, and more strategic.
What does that mean in practice?
Let me walk through what the research suggests. First, and this is crucial, movements need to do much more preparation before mass mobilization. One of the patterns Chenoweth has observed is that recent movements often mobilize quickly through social media, get huge numbers in the streets, but lack the organizational infrastructure to sustain pressure or adapt to repression.
So the viral moment isn't enough?
It's not. Successful historical movements spent months or years building coalitions, training participants in nonviolent discipline, developing communication networks that could survive crackdowns, stockpiling resources for sustained campaigns. That kind of preparation has become less common in the social media age.
Because it's so easy to just post and get people to show up.
Right. But showing up for one day isn't the same as sustained resistance. A government can wait out a single massive protest. What they can't survive is ongoing economic disruption, repeated demonstrations, and escalating non-cooperation over months or years.
What's the second adaptation movements need to make?
Tactical diversity. Too many recent movements have relied almost exclusively on street protests. That's one tactic. Historically successful movements use dozens of tactics: strikes, boycotts, work slowdowns, tax resistance, creating parallel institutions, non-cooperation by specific professional groups.
The South African boycott example from last episode.
Exactly. Economic pressure is often more effective than symbolic protest. When businesses start losing money, when governments can't collect taxes, when essential services are disrupted, that creates pressure that a march alone doesn't generate.
Are there examples of this working recently?
Sudan in 2019 is instructive. The movement there didn't just protest. They organized a general strike that shut down the economy. That, combined with sustained street presence and eventually key military defections, led to the ouster of Omar al-Bashir. It wasn't quick or easy, but they won because they combined mass participation with economic leverage.
What about dealing with surveillance and infiltration?
This is where movements need to get more sophisticated about security culture. Decentralized organizing structures help. If there's no single leader to arrest, the movement is harder to decapitate. Encrypted communications, though governments are getting better at cracking those too. Offline organizing and in-person networks that can't be easily monitored.
Sounds like movements need to become more like resilient networks than traditional organizations.
That's a good way to put it. But there's a tension there because some level of coordination is necessary for strategic action. Completely decentralized movements can be resilient, but also chaotic and undisciplined. Finding the right balance is an ongoing challenge.
What about the security force loyalty problem? That seems like the hardest nut to crack.
It is. But there are approaches. One is proactive outreach to security forces and their families before and during campaigns. Movements in Serbia and the Philippines made deliberate efforts to humanize themselves to police and soldiers, to frame the struggle as being for everyone's benefit, to make clear that there would be no retribution against security forces who didn't commit atrocities.
Giving them a safe path to neutrality or defection.
Exactly. Another approach is what's called strategic sequencing, starting with less confrontational tactics that build participation and legitimacy before escalating to actions that might trigger a security response. You want to reach that critical mass of public support before the crackdown comes, so that when it does come, the backlash is overwhelming.
What about international pressure? Does that still matter?
It can, but movements shouldn't rely on it. International attention is fickle, and geopolitical interests often override human rights concerns. That said, diaspora communities can play important roles in sustaining attention, raising resources, and pressuring foreign governments.
Let me ask the uncomfortable question. Given all these challenges, given that authoritarian regimes have gotten smarter, is peaceful protest still the right approach? Should movements consider other options?
The data still suggests that nonviolent resistance is more effective than violent resistance, even in this harder environment. Armed rebellion faces all the same challenges: surveillance, infiltration, international indifference, plus it has a much smaller participation base and gives regimes justification for maximum force. The historical success rate of violent campaigns has dropped too.
So it's not that violence has become more effective, it's that everything has become harder.
Exactly. And in that environment, the strategic advantages of nonviolence, mass participation, moral legitimacy, potential for defections, still matter. They're just not sufficient on their own anymore.
What's your overall takeaway for someone listening to this who cares about these issues?
A few things. First, the research is clear that nonviolent resistance remains the most effective tool for political change against unjust systems. That hasn't changed. Second, success requires more than showing up. It requires preparation, organization, tactical diversity, and discipline. Third, the environment has gotten harder, so movements need to be smarter and more strategic than their predecessors. And fourth, this is a long game. The movements that succeed are usually the ones that can sustain pressure over months or years, not days or weeks.
And for ordinary people who want to support these movements but aren't on the front lines?
Participation doesn't have to mean marching. It can mean providing resources, offering professional skills, supporting strikers financially, pressuring institutions to take stands, maintaining attention when media moves on. The 3.5% threshold counts active participants, but every movement also depends on a much larger base of supporters.
Dr. Torres, this has been a sobering but important conversation. Any final thoughts?
Just that history isn't over. Authoritarian regimes are adapting, but so are movements. The fundamental dynamics, that governments depend on cooperation, that mass non-cooperation can make them ungovernable, haven't changed. The challenge for this generation is to figure out how to apply those timeless principles in a new technological and political environment. The research suggests it can be done, but it requires taking organization and strategy as seriously as passion and courage.
Thank you for that. To our listeners, this research comes from Erica Chenoweth at Harvard Caddy School, Maria Stephen, and many other scholars studying civil resistance. The datasets are public, the books are available, and the findings are peer-reviewed. As always, our voices are synthetic, but the evidence is real. If you found the series valuable, share it. These are ideas that matter. Thanks for listening to The Synthetic Lens.